What if a single battle could decide the fate of an entire kingdom? On July 4th, 1187, under a merciless sun near the horns of Hattin, Saladin shattered the Crusader army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In a single day, nearly 90 years of Crusader dominance in the Holy Land began to collapse. What followed was not just a military defeat, it was the unraveling of an entire political order, the beginning of the end for Crusader Jerusalem, and the rise of one of history's most legendary commanders. But this disaster did not begin on the battlefield. It began years earlier, in the slow decay of leadership, unity, and judgment. By the late 1180s, the Crusader States were no longer the confident, aggressive power that had once carved out kingdoms in the East. Internally divided and strategically overstretched, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood on fragile foundations. The death of King Baldwin IV in 1185 removed the last ruler capable of commanding loyalty across the fractured nobility. Though young and physically ravaged by leprosy, Baldwin had held the kingdom together through authority, intelligence, and restraint. With him gone, restraint vanished. The crown passed to Guy de Lusignan, a king whose position rested more on political maneuvering than competence. Many of the kingdom's most experienced nobles questioned his judgment. Others openly opposed him. Rivalries hardened, alliances shifted, and the leadership of the kingdom fractured into bitter camps, each convinced the other would doom Jerusalem. One man understood this weakness better than anyone else: Saladin. By 1187, Saladin was no longer merely the Sultan of Egypt. Through patience, diplomacy, and calculated warfare, he had united Egypt, Syria, and large portions of Mesopotamia under his rule. Where the Crusaders argued, Saladin coordinated. Where they reacted emotionally, he planned methodically. His strength did not lie in overwhelming numbers alone. It lay in unity, discipline, and a deep understanding of how Crusader warfare functioned. Saladin studied his enemy closely. He knew the Crusaders relied heavily on shock cavalry, heavily armored knights whose charges could devastate opponents in open battle. But he also knew their weakness. They were slow, dependent on water, and vulnerable to exhaustion. In the dry heat of Palestine, armor became a burden. Horses required constant water. Without supply lines, even the strongest knight became helpless. And Saladin did not intend to face the Crusaders on their terms. He intended to force them onto his. The opportunity came in early July of 1187. Saladin launched an attack against Tiberias, a city connected to Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader nobles. This was no random strike. It was bait. Saladin knew the Crusaders would feel compelled to respond. He also knew they would argue about how. Raymond himself warned against marching inland. He urged the army to remain near Sepphoris, where fresh water and strong defensive positions could neutralize Saladin's advantages. Raymond understood the danger of leaving water sources behind. Others did not, or refused to listen. King Guy faced immense pressure. To remain stationary would be seen as weakness. To abandon Tiberias would be politically humiliating. Voices within the council, especially from militant factions, demanded action. Against better judgment, Guy made the decision that would doom the kingdom. The Crusader army would march. It was a fatal mistake. Under the blazing summer sun, the Crusaders moved eastward, carrying heavy armor, dragging supply wagons, and relying on water sources that Saladin already controlled. Almost immediately, Saladin's cavalry began to harass them. Light horse archers struck without engaging fully, exhausting both men and animals. Wells were blocked. Stragglers were cut down. The Crusaders could not rest. They could not regroup. Every hour drained their strength. By the time they reached the plateau near Hattin, the army was already breaking. Water was nearly gone. Horses collapsed. Men drank from muddy puddles. Discipline began to fray. Though the Crusaders camped within sight of the water they desperately needed, but Saladin's forces stood between them and survival. Saladin had positioned his army with precision. He controlled the high ground. He controlled the springs. And most importantly, he controlled the tempo of the battle. He did not rush. He did not overextend. He waited, knowing thirst would finish what steel did not. As dawn rose on July 4th, Saladin tightened the noose. Muslim forces surrounded the Crusader camp, attacking in waves, retreating, then striking again. Fires were set in the dry grass, sending smoke into Crusader lines, choking men already gasping from dehydration. Visibility collapsed. Morale crumbled. The Crusaders attempted desperate charges, but their cavalry, once their greatest strength, now moved slowly, their horses weakened, their formations disintegrating. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusader army, was captured. For the Crusaders, this was more than a battlefield loss. It was a spiritual catastrophe. Many believed divine protection had been withdrawn. Panic spread. Order vanished. The army that had marched with confidence only days before was now surrounded, exhausted, and leaderless. And Saladin had not yet delivered the final blow. With the true cross lost, the Crusader army ceased to function as a unified force. What remained was a mass of exhausted men surrounded on all sides, their formations shattered, their leaders struggling to impose control. The heat was unbearable. Thirst had become agony. Horses collapsed where they stood, crushing riders beneath them. Knights stripped off armor in desperation, only to be cut down moments later. Discipline, once the backbone of Crusader warfare, simply vanished. Saladin sensed the moment perfectly. He ordered a tightening encirclement, not a reckless charge. Muslim cavalry closed in gradually, striking at isolated groups, preventing any organized breakout. Every Crusader attempt to reach water failed. Every charge ended the same way, slowing, breaking apart, dissolving into chaos under arrow fire. The elite orders, the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, made repeated attempts to force a path through Saladin's lines. In earlier decades, such charges had decided battles. At Hattin, they collapsed within minutes. Dehydrated horses could not maintain speed. The knights' heavy armor, once a symbol of dominance, now dragged them down like chains. Saladin's troops did not panic. They did not rush. They waited for exhaustion to do its work. By midday, resistance became sporadic. Entire units surrendered where they stood. Others attempted to flee toward the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin, only to be cut off and surrounded. The battlefield was littered with discarded shields, broken lances, and the bodies of men who had marched believing God himself marched with them. At the center of the disaster stood King Guy de Lusignan. He had lost control of the army hours earlier. His commands went unheard. His banners no longer rallied men. When Saladin's forces finally closed in, Guy had no choice. He surrendered. The King of Jerusalem, captured alive, symbolized the complete collapse of Crusader authority. Alongside him were taken some of the most powerful figures in the Crusader world, the leaders of the military orders, senior nobles, veterans of decades of war. The ruling elite of the Kingdom of Jerusalem now stood as prisoners, surrounded by the army they had underestimated. Saladin's victory was absolute. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured. Only a handful escaped. The field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the force that defended the holy city, was destroyed in a single day. But Saladin understood something critical. Winning the battle was only the beginning. In the days following Hattin, Saladin moved swiftly. Without a field army, the Crusader cities were defenseless. One by one, strongholds fell. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, cities that had resisted for decades now opened their gates or collapsed under brief sieges. The psychological impact of Hattin traveled faster than Saladin's army itself. By September, Jerusalem stood isolated. Inside the city, panic spread. Refugees flooded in from fallen towns. Supplies dwindled. There was no army left to send. No relief force coming from Europe. The defenders knew the truth. Jerusalem could not withstand a prolonged siege. Saladin arrived with overwhelming force. He surrounded the city methodically, cutting off access, probing defenses, applying pressure without haste. Jerusalem was sacred, not only to Christians, but to Muslims as well, and Saladin intended to reclaim it without repeating the bloodshed of 1099. Inside the walls, arguments erupted. Some urged resistance to the death. The others understood that slaughter was inevitable if the city fell by force. Saladin offered terms. He promised safety in exchange for surrender. The defenders hesitated, knowing what Jerusalem meant to the Christian world, but hunger, fear, and reality made the decision for them. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. The moment shocked Europe, yet what followed shocked it even more. Saladin did not sack the city. He did not massacre its population. Ransoms were arranged. Civilians were spared. Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, were protected. Saladin entered Jerusalem not as a butcher, but as a ruler keenly aware of history and symbolism. For the Muslim world, the victory was transformational. Jerusalem's return marked the culmination of Saladin's lifelong mission. He had unified fractured territories, defeated a powerful enemy, and reclaimed Islam's third holiest city. His reputation spread rapidly, not only for victory, but for restraint. Even Christian chroniclers, writing from across enemy lines, acknowledged his conduct. For the Crusaders, the consequences were catastrophic. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was effectively destroyed. What remained of Crusader power clung desperately to a few coastal cities. The dream of permanent Christian control of the Holy Land was over. The psychological damage of Hattin was irreversible. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderclap. Kings mobilized, armies gathered. The Third Crusade was born. Richard, the Lionheart, Philip II of France, Frederick Barbarossa. The greatest military expedition since the First Crusade marched east, not to conquer, but to recover what had been lost. Yet even with all their strength, they would fail. Jerusalem would remain in Saladin's hands. Because Hattin was not just a defeat, it was a turning point. It proved that Crusader dominance could be broken, that unity could overcome tradition, that patience and strategy could destroy even the most feared knights of medieval warfare. And at the center of it all stood Saladin, calm, deliberate, relentless, waiting for his enemies to make the mistake he knew they would make. The shockwaves from Hattin did not stop at Jerusalem's walls. They rolled across Europe, across courts and kingdoms, across a Christian world stunned into disbelief. For nearly a century, the Crusader States had been portrayed as permanent, divinely protected footholds in the Holy Land. Hattin shattered that illusion in a single day. The fall of Jerusalem confirmed what many feared, but few dared to admit. The Crusader experiment was no longer sustainable. The response was immediate. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade. Kings who had once fought each other now turned their attention east. The greatest rulers of the age answered the call. Richard I of England, remembered as the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Never before had such power been assembled for a single campaign. Yet even this immense force would arrive too late to undo what Saladin had achieved. The Third Crusade would win battles. It would reclaim cities along the coast. It would produce legends and rivalries that echoed through history, but it would never erase Hattin. The destruction of the Crusader field army in 1187 had changed the strategic reality of the Holy Land forever. Saladin understood this. He knew that holding Jerusalem would not be easy. He also knew that his true victory lay not only in territory, but in legitimacy. By treating Jerusalem's population with restraint, by protecting holy sites, and by allowing negotiated surrender, he positioned himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler. Even his enemies took notice. Christian chroniclers who despised the loss of Jerusalem still wrote of Saladin with a measure of respect. In an age defined by brutality, his conduct stood apart. This reputation mattered. It softened resistance. It undermined Crusader propaganda. It strengthened his authority across the Muslim world. More importantly, Saladin had accomplished something no Crusader leader ever truly managed. He unified. Where the Crusader states had fractured under ambition and rivalry, Saladin had brought together Egyptians, Syrians, Kurds, Arabs, and Turks under a single command. His army fought with a shared purpose, guided by patience and discipline rather than desperation. Hattin was the result of that unity. Not an accident, not a gamble, but the final move in a carefully prepared campaign. The Third Crusade would test him. Richard the Lionheart proved a formidable opponent. Battles were fierce. Victories were costly on both sides. Yet even at the height of Richard's success, Jerusalem remained out of reach. Saladin refused to be drawn into another decisive confrontation. He remembered Hattin. He understood the value of caution. In 1192, after years of bloodshed, Richard and Saladin agreed to terms. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims were allowed access. The Crusader dream of reclaiming the city through force had failed, and it failed because of one day in 1187. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of systems, unity against division, strategy against pride, patience against impulse. The Crusaders did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they lacked cohesion, because they ignored warnings, because they marched when they should have waited. Saladin did not win because of numbers alone. He won because he understood time, terrain, and human weakness. He allowed the Crusaders to defeat themselves. In the centuries that followed, Hattin became a lesson repeated again and again by military thinkers. It demonstrated that supply lines matter more than heroics, that morale can be as decisive as steel, that leadership, when fractured, can doom even the strongest army. It also transformed Saladin into legend. To the Muslim world, he became a symbol of unity, resistance, and faith. To the Christian world, he became the embodiment of a worthy enemy, respected even in defeat. His name endured long after castles crumbled and kingdoms vanished. The Crusader states would linger for another century, clinging to the coast, but they would never recover their dominance. Never again would they march inland with confidence. Never again would Jerusalem fall under their rule, because Hattin had broken something deeper than an army. It had broken the belief that the Crusaders were unstoppable, and once that belief was gone, everything else followed. What began as a march under the summer sun ended as the collapse of a kingdom. One decision led to another. One mistake multiplied into catastrophe, and one commander, patient, calculating, and relentless, waited until the moment was right. Saladin did not just win a battle at Hattin. He changed the course of history. A single day, a single battlefield, and the fall of Jerusalem began.